Welcome, Suleika, to the House of Beautiful Business. So happy that you found the time.
Thank you for having me.
Since the power of words really runs through, I would say, not only clearly through your book, but also through your life. You know, when you were about to have a bone marrow transplant after having been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia at the age of 22, doctors said to you that you had about a 35% chance of survival. And I was struck by one point in your book where you basically pondered together with the reader, what would you write if you knew that you might die soon? And part of your answer back then was, I traveled to where the silence was in my life. So I wonder, what does writing mean to you? What does it represent to you?
Yeah, I have, my father's Tunisian, my mom is Swiss. I grew up mostly in the US, but traveled quite a bit for a long time. So I think, like a lot of kids who grew up between cultures and often on the kind of fringes of different cultures without ever really feeling a sense of belonging, words and books have always felt like a home for me, where yeah, they've been my hiding place. They've been my finding place. And so, for a long time, I was someone who wrote in the privacy of a journal. And I didn't really know that one could actually be a writer as a profession. I still have my questions about that. And when I got sick, in those first couple of months, I was 22. I spent most of that time in isolation in a hospital room. And as I saw my friends and classmates starting their first jobs and traveling the world and going to parties and all the big and small milestones of young adulthood, for a while I felt profoundly stuck. And it seemed impossible to think how I might participate in the world and what I might possibly be able to write about when I couldn't report or travel anywhere. And eventually it occurred to me that even though I couldn't be a war correspondent, which after that class had been my dream, that I could report from the front lines of my hospital bed on a very different kind of conflict zone. And the second I understood that, it occurred to me that I had a surplus of material right there in my room, and that it was possible to report on that experience. Susan Sontag, in her essay that was turned into a book called Illness as Metaphor, describes how we all have dual citizenship in the kingdom of the sick and in the kingdom of the well. So, in that first year after the end of treatment, I made it my mission to kind of repatriate myself back to the kingdom of the well. But it wasn't, like you said, this binary construct where you could pivot from one to the other. And what I did when I was recovering from that experience was to create a kind of rite of passage for myself in the form of a very long road trip. Although first I had to learn how to drive, important first step. And I went on this 15,000 mile road trip around the United States, where I visited some of the strangers who'd been writing me letters in response to my New York Times column over the years, and who were grappling with reentry, or the impossibility of reentry in certain cases, in all kinds of different contexts. And what I kind of arrived to at the end of that road trip was that in some ways I was probably always going to live in that in-between place. And I might even venture to say that most of us live somewhere between the kingdom of the sick and the kingdom of the well.
And I wonder, with all of your experience and then all the stories you heard, how has your relation to pain changed since then? Have you been able to learn how to deal with it differently?
I started to kind of seek out these examples of people who had found ways to interrogate their suffering and to make of it something creative and perhaps even something useful to other people. And that's not to say that it's always very easy to do. I remember these hospital volunteers, these very kind, well-intentioned hospital volunteers would offer these arts and crafts classes. And I was always enraged when they came to my room with an invitation to like make a dream catcher or a beaded, pasta necklace. It always felt incredibly infantilizing to me and not at all what I wanted to do. But once I found my own language and my own mode of expression, I started to understand that within this experience, there was an invitation, and that within my limited energy, I had about 3 hours of energy during the day when I could do something. I would have to get very specific with what I wanted to do with those 3 hours. And so for me, that meant returning to my first love, which was writing. And when I started, I just wrote for myself. And I started a 100-day project with my family and friends, and it was really simple. And the idea was that each of us for 100 days would do something creative, a small creative act.
Yet another 100-day project, which you started just this spring. It's called the Isolation Journals, and it's a stunning project. You started it when we were all in a COVID-induced lockdown, and we were all feeling very isolated. And all of a sudden, Suleika did what she does best, which is turn, in this case, collective suffering into art.
So as New York went into lockdown in early March, everything about that experience felt eerily familiar to me. I found myself back at my parents' house in isolation in their attic. And it occurred to me that in a weird way, it felt familiar, almost comfortingly familiar, without diminishing the very real sort of suffering and fear that was kind of ravaging the whole world at that time. And it occurred to me that I had learned these tools to deal with my own isolation at the time, and that there might be a way to kind of bring that to other people. So in starting the Isolation Journals, I kind of reprised this 100-day journal and thought I would invite a larger community to participate in journaling. And so I invited my artist friends, my musician friends, and all the kind of wonderful humans that I know to draft prompts and mini essays. And within about 2 days of launching the Isolation Journals, we had 40,000 people signed up. But the second piece of it that was important to me wasn't just inviting people to journal in the privacy of their own homes, but to invite them, if they wanted to share those journal entries. Because something that I've learned again and again in my work is that when you dare to be vulnerable on the page, and you dare to share that vulnerability with a larger community, there's a reverberation that happens.
And I just wondered what you do to stay in the present moment, because I think that's, you describe it quite intensely as you are driving for 100 days through the whole country, through all, I think 33 states, meeting all these people. You have so much to process from the past. You have so many things you're considering in the future. And I'm guessing that was a very vivid learning process of staying in the present. What do you do to stay in the present now?
Yeah. I have a very consistent practice of naming the things that I'm grateful for. And I try not to fixate on the kind of extraordinary moments, but to fixate on the ordinary moments, kind of tiny, beautiful, ordinary moments that happen in all of our days that are easy to overlook, because they're simple or they're ongoing. And of course, it's easy to overlook them or to take them for granted. And so that's what I do.
After 100 days on the road with lots and lots of strangers, what kind of a tip do you have for anyone who is now about to pack their bags on the first part of the triple trip? What kind of advice do you have for somebody who undertakes such a huge endeavor, such as a 100-day road trip through the US or their own country?
Yeah, I think any trip, outside of just sightseeing, is an invitation to create a ritual around it. For me, with the road trip, I wanted to challenge myself to do things that made me very uncomfortable. But the second thing that I really wanted to do, especially after being sick and being dependent on caregivers, was to learn how to be alone. I was someone who, even prior to my diagnosis, never did anything alone. I never went out to eat by myself. I never traveled by myself, even though I kind of thought of myself as this independent person. But certainly after my illness, I didn't feel safe in my own body. And I had been forced to be dependent on caregivers in a way where eventually that had come to feel normal. And so I really wanted to learn to be alone. Again, that felt like an important part of figuring out how to sort of thrust myself back out into the world. And so I decided that in between these different stops where I was visiting people, I was going to camp. And I did have my dog, Oscar, so I wasn't entirely alone. But I think it's something that for me was hugely important, not just to my recovery, but to developing a sense of confidence in my autonomy. And I think learning to enjoy your own company and finding ways to convert isolation into solitude is something that is profoundly empowering, however you do it.